because I have a tendency to forget doing that. So thank you everyone for joining us this afternoon at Understanding and Comparing Aid Offers. I'm going to introduce myself and my companion in just a moment, but I'd like to welcome you today. We are recording this webinar, so if for some reason you have to leave, we were at a presentation this morning where the presenter was juggling managing his kids in school and trying to present to us like a total superhero. We can't see you, we can't hear you, so do what you need to do if you need to leave. The recording will be made available. I'll be sending a follow-up email letting you know when that's available, as well as you'll see it on our website. So just be on the lookout for that. I am Maria McDougall, and I'm one of the college access counselors here at FAME. And with me today, I have the fabulous Nikki Vachon, who's going to be monitoring the chat and the Q&A. So as I mentioned earlier, I do have a poll built into this, but I would love it if you would interact with us and each other via the chat. There's a great mix of folks on the call today, some financial aid professionals, many school counselors, some other folks. So please interact with each other and with us. I'm going to pause periodically through the presentation to address some questions, but if we don't get to everything, I will make sure that I follow up with you via email after the fact, and everyone will have access to those answers as well. We're going to cover a bunch of different things today. It's going to feel familiar to those of you that have been through this presentation before, but the end is going to be slightly different. So we're going to start with a high-level overview of the financial aid process, just so you understand kind of where aid offers fit within the financial aid cycle. Then we're going to talk about the notification itself. We'll go over the parts, what's included, what's not included, what to look for. We'll go over strategies for comparing financial aid offers, which is a really, I looked at the registration questions, and some students already asking questions are already receiving aid offers. So we're right in the thick of this starting to happen. So we'll present some strategies for helping navigate students through that process. And we're going to end slightly differently than we have in the past by looking at strategies for appealing. So we all know 2020 was a wacky year. The current version of the FAFSA looks at 2019 income information. 2020 might have been drastically different. It was for many folks. And that might mean the financial aid offers need to be revisited. So at the end, we'll take some time to talk about expectations there and strategies for completing the appeals process. So here's how the process works. And I included kind of the frequency at which this happens. I did notice there were some names on there that I didn't recognize, so welcome if you're new to FAME webinars. But I did want to indicate kind of what to look for in this process. So the student and at least one of their parents creates an FSA ID, which is the username and password that kind of unlocks everything federal student aid related, and is how the FAFSA is signed electronically by the student and parent. Thankfully, this process happens once. Sometimes you have to reset the password or things like that, but it's kind of a clunky process for many people. So one time gets you in and is established for your signature. Then the FAFSA is completed. So that has to be done every year that the students are interested in receiving financial aid. The information is sent electronically to the schools that the student indicates they're interested in. And the school reviews the information and sends a financial aid offer, which is what we're talking about today. So this is kind of where we're at in the process, where many students are at this point. Then students will compare financial aid offers. Now, if they're a returning student, they're just looking at the aid offer that the college is giving them as a returning student. But new students might have a few from different colleges that they'll need to compare. We'll talk about that. Then the student completes any requirements. So some things have annual requirements, like going in and accepting the aid, any kind of paperwork for work study, those kinds of things. And some things are just once a year, but they are just one time, but they are going to have things to complete for financial aid to pay to the bill. The school will process it. If there's any documentation, communication from the financial aid office happens throughout. Shameless plug to remind students to check their email. I don't know if I'm going to say that later in the presentation, but I'm going to try to remember to encourage students to check their email. And then any process aid will show up on the bill, and usually bills are by semester. So that's a really sort of fast, high level overview of how the process works. And we're kind of in that middle row. right now. Students have done the FAFSA, we hope, and they are starting to receive those aid offers. And then now we're going to dive into the specifics of what things look like now. So a financial aid offer is a paper or electronic notification sent by the financial aid office after the student has been offered admission. Generally, like, you'll get one piece of paper. I'll talk about that. I've heard that there are many schools offering electronic only, especially as a result of the pandemic. It's hard to keep up with mail in some cases, but it's a notification that is a breakdown of the types and amounts of financial aid that have been offered to that student. That's the baseline definition of what the financial aid offer is. So how do schools determine what's on the financial aid offer? And I'm going to try not to get too far in the weeds. Both Nikki and myself are former financial aid people, so we've kind of seen the other side of how this works, which gives us a good background to help students through this. But I'm going to try to keep it as simple as possible in terms of what the determination looks like. All schools kind of take an equation. So they're looking at the cost of attendance, and they subtract out that EFC. So if you recall from students you worked with who filed the FAFSA, once the FAFSA is completed, the family has what's called the expected family contribution, which again is not an amount of money they have to pay or what their bill is going to be. It's a measurement of what portion of income could go towards higher education. I like to think of it as more like a credit score versus an actual dollar amount. They take the cost of attendance, they subtract out that EFC, and what is left is need. And that's the basic formula. And because cost of attendance varies school by school, need also varies. And so schools will meet a certain percentage of need depending on their ability and their available funds. How do they do this? They try to do it as best they can with a combination of different types of aid. And we're going to talk about the various types of aid a little bit later. But it's usually a combination of federal financial aid determined by the FAFSA, state, and institutional resources. So it's a kind of a conglomeration of all of those types of aid. But oftentimes there is a gap between the student's need and the financial aid offered. So just keeping that in mind, there's usually some kind of gap that the family has to address. These are the types of aid that might be offered to meet that need. Gift aid, which is the stuff you want, the golden ticket, maximizing as much of this as possible, is grants and scholarships that do not have to be repaid. So that is the free money. That is the stuff everybody wants. And then there are federal direct loans, which are student loans that are not credit-based, right? And they're loans in the student's name. They don't need a cosigner. They don't need a credit check, that are designed to have limits in place to help students meet their financial obligation to the college. But they do have to be repaid. They are loans. They do have interest attached. There's also work study, which is money that is available to be earned by working during the academic year. And I am a former work study person. Nobody wakes up in the morning and wants to be a financial aid counselor when they grow up, but I started as a work study student in the financial aid office. And it was really valuable work experience, but also allowed me to earn some money while I was going to college. An important note here, and I'm going to touch again on this later, but it's important to say that the work study offer will show up as part of the financial aid package. It does not come off the bill. So that's a really important thing to stress with families. If they're seeing this work study amount, and let's say it's, I don't know why the slide just fit. Let's say it's $3,500. They're not going to see that $3,500 come off the bill. That is the amount that the student can earn in their pocket, just like any other job. So I just want to make that clear. That will come up again a little bit later. And those are the types of aid. I'm going to address one final sort of overview here, and then I'm going to pause and see if we have anything in the Q&A. So how and when will they arrive? So I talked about this a little bit, paper or email notification. If they are getting a paper letter, it's usually just one. It's usually the first time, first student, they're getting that piece of paper in the mail. And then any follow-up communications, or once they become what's called a returning student, so in subsequent years, they're getting everything via email in that student portal. So again, might get a piece of paper. I think there are some schools that are even doing away with that to start with. But then it's all that, university email that they're utilizing for follow-up communications. Financial aid offices are working to get them out ASAP. It looks like the majority of you have heard from students that they are receiving them. I know some folks who got them in late January, so kudos to our financial aid offices for getting those out quickly and making sure that students can do the work of comparing, which we're going to talk about shortly. Nikki, anything in the chat or Q&A that's worth shouting out at the moment?
Yeah, two quick things. I was just, as you were talking, thinking about the possibility that mail might be delayed this year, because a lot of people have had some delays. So I'm thinking how important it is, you had mentioned earlier, to check email, to keep an eye on that student portal, because there may be some delays with mail. Secondly, great question in the Q&A. Somebody's son received a merit offer, but it didn't show work study as an option. So I gave my 2 thoughts about that. What's your 2 thoughts?
Yes, so I'm glad that question was asked. So merit is kind of a different bucket. So merit usually comes at the point of admission. So you're offered something off the top. Sometimes it's referred to as a tuition discount, where right off the top, congratulations, you're in. They've got that big envelope if they're getting them in the mail. And then there's a merit if the school offers it. The financial aid, so things like work study, things like Pell Grant if the student's eligible, some of the other types we're going to talk about are determined based on the FAFSA. So that's not going to show up at the same time generally as your merit scholarship. So great question. Nikki, is that the gist of what you responded as well? Okay, great. So I wanted to shift, as we're going to start talking about the specifics, we're going to dive into kind of the nitty gritty on some of these. I wanted to highlight this for just a moment. Sally Mae did a presentation, gosh, what is time? It was sometime in 2020 that I attended, and they did a survey of kind of ability to interpret financial aid offers, because every school has, despite the fact that they're all using that same formula, the cost of attendance minus EFC equals need, they all present the financial aid offers in a different way. And sometimes it's really tricky when you're looking at a couple of them, and this is part of what we're going to talk about today, to really understand the bits and pieces and to really compare them for that bottom line. So 67% of families said they received an offer letter. 43% of those families found at least one component difficult to understand, and 16% didn't know that the aid offer might include loans. So a couple of years ago, I remember hearing a similar survey where there were some aid offers that the loan, like the direct student loan, didn't actually say loan at the end. They called it something different, and it was almost misleading. None of the colleges in Maine do this. Our award letters are very clear and easy to understand for the most part. But I just wanted to highlight that there are thousands of schools in the country, and they're like snowflakes, really. There aren't going to be a lot of standardized, you're not going to be able to easily look at 2 aid offers and see how they, and they'll look identical. So I just wanted to kind of point this out. So if you're hearing that students are confused or families are like, what does this mean? Help me interpret it, that they are not alone and that this is something that happens across all of the schools. My favorite sort of analogy for this is that financial aid offers are like apples and apricots and oranges, right? They're all round fruits, but they look a little bit different, right? They're all together in the fruit bowl. They have similar components, but they look a little bit different. So before we jump into that, I want to do this poll. So bear with us, as this is kind of new. We're polling sort of outside the Zoom. So if you, in your browser or on your mobile device, go to pollev.com/FameMaine292, you should be able to respond to this question. And the responses will pop in as we go. So when I say trends, I mean, what are you seeing? For those of you that responded in the registration that you're seeing financial aid offers, are they different than you've seen in the past? Are they the same? Are there things that you really liked and thought were clear? Are families just totally confused still and you're not sure? I'd love to see any responses you have. So we'll take a minute or so and let you guys try this out. And thank you for allowing us to explore this polling platform with you all today. We're trying to encourage different ways to be engaged with each other and with you. Students are still waiting. Okay. Some are easier to read. Great. Haven't seen any yet. Okay. And a lot of that is really going to depend on when, when they've applied to the colleges, if they've been accepted yet. There are certainly variables there. Some offers do not show bottom line costs. That's important. We're going to talk about that. They're getting more alike over time. That's great. I think that would be a huge benefit for sure. Okay, others are difficult to access. Okay, great. And one thing that will be interesting to see is when I send a follow-up presentation, I want to see if I can synthesize some of these responses and include those in the follow-up. So this will be a good test run. Confusing. Okay, great. I'm going to give it about 15 more seconds and then we'll keep going. But thank you for participating, and I'm glad to see things popping up that way. Offers provided only online. I suspected that might happen with some schools, particularly as Nikki mentioned with mail delays. And I know like it's any places where there's stuff happening in person might be skeleton crews, and mail is just, I remember stuffing envelopes as a work study student with financial aid offer letters, so there might not be capacity to do those things. Oh, we have a parent with us. Great. Okay, offers parent plus loans are showing up. Yep. Yeah, we'll talk about some of those pieces. Great. I'm going to move us along, but thank you so much for participating in that. Really cool to see stuff popping up. Turned out really great. So thank you for that. So we're going to talk about the things that are going to be included. So we're going to dive in a little bit into what to look for and some of the pieces that might be different. And we've included some example aid offers to kind of see how you might break them down. So some things you might find are the types of aid, which we hope is a general component across all of them. They might have, be called different things. You may or may not see the cost of attendance on there, although I think the majority of the ones that I've seen are at least putting some kind of, here's where we started. Assumptions used, and what this means is, let's say in the FAFSA you indicated you were going to be full-time or living on campus or with parents. They're saying this is the criteria we use to determine your cost of attendance and therefore your financial aid. They might show you the calculation. So some might show you here's what we did and how to calculate that bottom line balance that someone mentioned. Might also include other funding options, inserts for like next steps or other things you might be aware of. Especially if it's a packet and they mail, there might be a couple of little inserted things in there for information you need to know ahead of time. So let's take a look at some examples. So here's one for Gryffindor College. You've got two like HP nerds in the room with you here. So as an example, you'll see here that the aid is kind of broken down by kind of what category it falls into, which is really great. So you'll see gift aid, that's the free money. So we talked about that. That's like, they're gonna put that front and center. Here's what you have for gift aid. This is the cream of the crop, doesn't have to be repaid, good stuff first. You'll see it all broken down there. You'll also see the work study is separated out. It does say earned paycheck next to it, which I happen to really like just because it's clear. I might also want to take it one step further and a little asterisk that says it doesn't come off the bill, right, as a good reminder. And then you'll see the loans, and they clearly state here must be repaid. They did list the assumptions. They said, okay, so what was your EFC? What year in college are you? In-state, out-of-state, what your enrollment is. They've clearly indicated on this one, here's what we use to determine this financial aid. Then they also calculated the bills. They're like, here's the direct cost, the stuff you get billed for. Here, we're going to subtract out all that free money because we know you want that. You're going to take that. And then here's kind of what's left. And then if you borrowed those federal loans, what would you be looking at? Right. So this one is clearly spread out all of the different options and separated out the types of aid. Here's one from Capital University. So a similar kind of breakdown in that they've really also kind of sandwiched together the grants and scholarships, the loans, and then separated out work study. And it's what I like about this one is it does say not to be applied to student account, right? They're putting that reminder there to show you that, like, yes, this is part of your financial aid offer. It's something that you have to earn as a student, but it's not coming off that bottom line. They did at the top there also include the calculation, kind of here's what your direct costs are, the total financial aid offer. They also kind of over to the right there, just under that pink bracket, you'll see, you know, there's a section that says other financing options. So payment plans, they have, you know, they encourage you to check on military benefits, private student loans. So they've kind of said, here are some other options for meeting that gap that we talked about earlier. Right, so that's how this one is similar but different. Then there's this erudite college aid offer, and some of them do look like this. So it is all the aid is kind of lumped into one, which isn't necessarily bad, but it's not as broken down by type as those other two that we just looked at. So it does list the grants and things first, and usually that's the case. They'll put the free money at the top. You'll see work study there is kind of sandwiched in as well, with no reminder that work study is not coming off the bill. So I know that, you know, in this case, this might be something that's a little bit confusing to a family because it's not really broken down. You do see the annual direct costs there. They've also called the indirect costs possible additional expenses, which I like, right? And you'll see kind of some of what they said, the full versus part-time, living on campus, that sort of thing. So again, they all kind of have similar parts, but they're laid out a little bit differently, right? Do we have questions or comments on this, Nikki?
Just a couple questions on direct subsidized and unsubsidized loans, if you were going to cover that.
Sure. I wasn't going to dive too far into that, but I can certainly summarize kind of what the difference is. A subsidized loan is technically need-based, and that means that the interest and payments are made by the government while the student's in school. So it's not accruing any interest as long as the student is enrolled at least half time. The unsubsidized portion does begin to accrue interest from the point of disbursement, and students can either pay on it as they go, or it will get capitalized and added on at the end of the loan. These direct federal student loans, if you're going to borrow, are an excellent starting point. We usually recommend starting here first when you're going to borrow, just because there are lots of different repayment options in place once they get done, certain kinds of forgiveness programs as well. They're low fixed interest rates. They're not credit based. It's also a really great way for students to build credit history once they graduate versus like a credit card. Debt is a reality for most families. You know, unfortunately, people are, you know, they don't want to go there, and we understand that. But for many families, meeting that gap is really going to include some kind of borrowing. So those are the main differences. You'll see, you might see on an aid offer, depending on eligibility, that it's all unsubsidized loan, because that subsidized portion is based on that need calculation. So remember, cost of attendance minus EFC equals need. But that's the main difference between those types of loans. Anything else, Nikki, that we should shout out here? Okay, I'll keep us rolling. So I want to talk about comparing them, right? So we've indicated that they're all kind of different. They all might look, and then we've assumed here the examples we've given you are paper examples. We haven't even talked about sort of the digital only ones and what those might look like, and depending on what the portals look like and, you know, their capability to spread things out or not might be even more complex, right? But either way, comparison is key. So for first-time students, they might get 2, 3, 4 or more aid offers. And just by looking at them, you're not going to be able to tell kind of what that bottom line is. And I think that's what most people want to get at, particularly parents, right? If you're working with a family, they're like, I just need to know what I have to pay and how I'm going to do it. And you won't necessarily be able to tell which one is the best financial fit just by looking at them. So there are tools that exist to help you do this. I am partial to our worksheet, the comparing financial aid offers worksheet. Nikki's going to put a link for that in the chat. I also like it because it does the math for you. We'll show you an example of that in a minute, because despite being a financial aid person, I don't do math. So if it's going to calculate for me, I'm going to use it. And what's great is you can line up, you'll see them right side by side, all the raw numbers. We do have informational videos on our website about kind of what we're talking about today that are designed for students and families. So you can always send them in that direction. We have one that is going to go over all this comparison stuff. There are other online tools you might use. I've had families who are really Excel savvy, who made their own spreadsheet, right, and put all the information in, or they made a Google sheet, or they have some other like finance app that they've used. I don't necessarily care how you compare them. It is important to do the math and to figure out kind of what your bottom line is, because just because one thing has more stuff on it doesn't necessarily mean it's the best deal. You might see one offer of, you know, some kind of institutional aid that looks like a big number, but once you do all the math, it's not any better than any of the other offers. So really drilling down and looking at those numbers is important for determining, okay, if financial considerations have to be like the deciding factor, you want to make sure you have all of the information at your fingertips. So here's an example. We took our aid offers and we plugged them into this worksheet. So you'll see, you know, it does the math for you. At the bottom, we have singled out work study. So it's our way of reminding you, and we have a little footnote there that it's part of the financial aid offer, but it exempts itself from the math. It's not going to calculate in. We do that intentionally, right? So again, you'll be able to see at the top there, you'll put in what those direct costs are. And if it wasn't listed on the aid offer, you might have to go to the college's website to kind of find that information. Room and board, same thing. And then you'll know, okay, this is like estimated billable costs. Then you're going to subtract out all of the free money, the grants and scholarships. Might be easier to do on those aid offers that separate it all out for you, totaled it up, but go through anything that says scholarship, grant, add that in there. And you'll have your bottom line before any borrowing. So right off the top, you'll know this is what I'm looking at. And that this is where I would include merit. So if you knew you got a merit scholarship, you know, figure all that out. And then you'll have your loans. So you can say, if I borrow these federal direct loans, what's my bottom line now? And then you'll be able to do the balance due. And it does give you a line for indirect costs. So there are other expenses that go along with paying for college, right? Books is probably the most common, books and supplies. There's usually like miscellaneous fees, parking fee, traveling, things like that. And a reminder about books is that generally books are not going to show up on the bill. So that's what we call a planned out-of-pocket expense. It's the phrase I used to use a lot when I was working in a financial aid office, which means you have to sort of show up on day one with the books purchased. There are some exceptions to this, of course, but the reality is, you know, factoring it into the costs and figuring out a plan for how you're going to meet some of those indirect costs is really important here too, which is why we've included that there. And then you'll be able to see the numbers right across the book, and then you can decide once you're figuring out your plan to pay, which option you're going to go with if that's your primary consideration. And then I would take this one step further and look at the total cost of education. We'll talk about that towards the end, but, you know, considering, okay, we can meet 1 year, what does 2 or 3 or 4 years down the road look like, and how are we going to move forward with that? Encourage students, as you're working with them, to consider if any of the aid is renewable, and what the criteria are for keeping something. So if there was merit, there's usually a GPA requirement, a full-time status requirement. There might be amounts that fluctuate year over year depending on cost of attendance or what the EFC is. Any outside scholarships that they got, find out if those are renewable, encourage them to write a thank you note so that they're given it again. All of those things, and remind them again that costs could increase each year. I know many schools are kind of doing like tuition freezes and things like that in response to the pandemic, but other things might go up in turn. So thinking about increases each year and looking at the total cost of attendance, especially in a situation where a family is going to need to borrow. So when you're considering long-term impact, return on investment, debt considerations, it's important to look beyond just the first year. I know Nikki and I both have worked with students who are like, I want to go to this school and I'm going to make it work for 1 year. And then we say, well, let's multiply that by 4. Can you make that work long term? You know, and then it comes down to, how much of a financial pickle are you willing to put yourself in for, maybe there's an option that's a little less expensive or a combination of options. So just thinking about the total cost of education is going to be really key as you're working with families. Nikki, any comments, questions?
Just another great question, by the way. These are awesome, but someone did ask if a student could pay unsubsidized interest while they're in school.
Yes, and if they are able to, we absolutely would encourage them to do that. It's especially on an amount, if they're getting it in conjunction with subsidized, it's going to be $2,000 for that first year. The total maximum as a first year student, I'm going to use that as an example, is $5,500 for a dependent student. So the interest is not an astronomical amount. And if they're working or they want to take that work study paycheck and turn around and pay their student loan interest, I want them to come on the road with me and tell people that they're doing that, because it will save them in the long run. So absolutely no penalties to even repay early. So I have had some students and families who they just pay the debt off early as they're going along. If you have that capability, great. Good question. Things to consider, again, different process at each school. Unmet need is filled first in most cases. So the school is going to do its best to kind of meet the unmet need. And for scholarships, what they're doing is, again, you always want to report everything. So one of our favorite things to do is like myth busting. So there is a general misconception out there that too many scholarships impacts your financial aid negatively. If it does at all, it's pretty rare. And there have even been circumstances, like I've done this as a financial aid person, where like, let's make sure you're paying the full amount, that your budget matches your full room and board amount. Let's see where we can increase that cost of attendance a little bit so this doesn't negatively impact. You always want to report everything. And I look at it like every free scholarship dollar you have is one less dollar you have to borrow and repay with interest. So I'm never going to say don't apply for every scholarship you can, because it might hurt your financial aid. If there's any impact, it's really going to be minimal. Why are my slides moving on their own? I have a ghost. Keep that in mind as we're going forward, right? So always, always, always encouraging families to look for scholarships. And it's one of those things where there might be a swap. So if there's institutional dollars, let's say college, not the merit, but institutional from the financial aid, they might say, oh, they got a $1,000 scholarship. We're just going to swap that money back into the pool. So it's at worst a wash. Okay. So if you're seeing something different than that, if you've got a family who got a bunch of scholarships and is like, it feels like their aid was really negatively impacted, have them reach out to us or to the financial aid office to walk through why that was and get some clarity there. But in general, they're going to try to fill that unmet need as much as possible. The way you report scholarships might be different. So you might have to upload letters to the portal or send in documentation via mail, or just find out anything that's a private outside scholarship, how the financial aid office expects you to report that. And if the money is paid directly to the school, they're going to find out about it anyway. So just to, being proactive about that will be helpful. If there does need to be a reduction, they're going to try to reduce loan eligibility first, which is what you want, right? Reduce that debt. Absolutely. You don't want to have to repay that. There might be a situation where they'll call and say, are you going to use all your work study? If not, we'll just swap that out because it's a need-based aid. So they're going to try to do that whenever possible. More scholarships is fewer loans, and certainly have them ask any questions. I shared this meme with some high school kids and they didn't get it. And I'm starting to realize that like they might not know this Oprah the you get a car, you get a car, you get a car reference. So that was a real awakening for me recently. A couple of other things to consider as we've talked about, how long will the student be in school? Are they going to be able to sustain the plan? So let's say that we're going to figure out kind of what we're going to do this year. We're going to do a combination of savings and loans, and we've got first year covered. Is that same plan going to work every year if costs are going up? Spend some time on our salary debt calculator. So we have this tool on our website where you can sort of say, this is my debt and this is the interest rate. What does my salary need to be in order to pay that off and still have some sense of a quality of life. And what's really funny is, funny / shocking sometimes, is like what it tells you you need to earn per hour to pay off any existing debt that you have, which I think doing the numbers sometimes and really drilling it down with real life examples can really hit home with some students. So if you need to kind of sit down and do a real life calculation, I encourage you to spend some time on our salary to debt calculator. And then if it's feeling like you've done this math and you're like, man, we got to figure a way to get costs down, find out, can you change the housing plan? Can you negotiate a different meal plan? Like, I didn't eat breakfast in the dining hall. I didn't get up before 9 a.m. So I didn't choose any classes early. So I ate Pop-Tarts in my room. I didn't need the 3 meals a day meal plan, right? Find out if those options, again, living at home. And I know some families are like, no way, but room and board is almost always the most expensive component of the college process, kind of across the board. So if even for the first year or two, if living at home and commuting is an option, and now, almost everything is at least partially virtual. So those are also things to consider to keep costs down. Questions there, thoughts, comments? We're gonna take the last chunk of time to talk about if things are different. Nikki, anything?
Yep, just a quick note. As someone had asked about what happens if they get a scholarship from the VFW, and will that affect their financial aid? I feel like you covered that, but I again just wanted to.
Yeah, so that would be sort of a private outside scholarship because it's separate from coming from the institution itself. So, report it to the financial aid office. Again, the financial aid office is gonna try to fill whatever unmet need gap they have first. And then if there needs to be any kind of adjustment, they're going to try to tackle reducing loan eligibility first. Maybe they'll look at work study, but it's not an automatic like, okay, now everything's going to change. So you can certainly check in, especially if it's $500 to $2,000. Generally has very minimal impact, if any, on the financial aid, because again, most families have some kind of gap of unmet need that needs to be filled first. Hope that answers that question. So we're going to address the rest of the presentation kind of in the situation we are in now. There are likely many families that have been financially impacted by the pandemic. As a reminder, the FAFSA for this current group of seniors was looking at 2019 income information. 2020 happened. Lots of folks experienced an upheaval in their earnings and their careers. Temporary or permanent job loss, a whole series of things. So 2019 might not accurately represent what the financial circumstances are. And now it's 2021 and that still might be the case, right? So if you're looking at it and you're going, seems like not enough given what our current financial circumstances are, we always recommend appealing the financial aid offer. So just some kind of terminology to get us started. I'm going to use appeal. The financial aid vernacular of this is like professional judgment. So that's what they're going to call it from the financial aid office usually. And this just means that the Higher Education Act allows financial aid offices to sort of readjust after the FAFSA has been filed based on financial special circumstances. Sometimes that phrase will be thrown around, the special circumstances. Usually that is attached to like changing the dependency status. So a student suddenly becoming independent versus dependent and needing parent information on the FAFSA. But you'll see that, special circumstances, special conditions, things like that. They're all kind of appealing, making an exception to the rule, for lack of a better term. Okay, so I'm going to use appeal as we move forward. Here's the process is, again, might be different school to school. So there might be a form that the student has to fill out initially. Almost always there is going to be some kind of appeal letter required. So some kind of letter or the statement that outlines the situation. Here's where we were, here's where we are. This has impacted our ability to pay for college, right? Maybe you've got someone good with words. If you need a framework or a starting point, there is a website called Swift Student, which we've discovered, which literally kind of will create a template for you to build an appeal letter. even if the school requires a specific form and they give you a section to like explain, a letter of support to go with that really clearly outlines the circumstances is generally recommended, just to really paint the picture of what the circumstances are. So I think Nikki will throw that in the chat for the Swift students. A really great, easy to use tool to determine, to kind of give you a beginning, middle, and end of how to write an appeal letter. Who is asking? You know, ideally, this is the student's process. They're starting the FAFSA. They're receiving financial aid for their college education. But generally, it's the parents' finances that have been impacted the most. So the parent will usually take the lead in the appeals process. So either the parent or the student can write a letter. Usually it's on behalf of the family kind of circumstance. So when you're crafting this letter, you really want to summarize the situation. So in 2019, you know, we had our business. In 2020, we lost our business. And really focus on, like, it wasn't like we just decided to pick up and move, right? Or to leave everything. You know, the pandemic impacted us X, Y, and Z. Be clear about, you know, this was beyond our plan and beyond our control. Also include any documentation. So any of the financial aid colleagues joining us will say document everything, right? And anything that's submitted doesn't leave the financial aid office. It's all confidential and protected. But anything that, you know, illustrates the situation. So, you know, severance letters, pay stubs, separation notices, anything like that will be confidentially kept in the student's file. But anything that can support the information coming from the letter. It might also be a letter of support from another individual close to the family or from the employer, things like that. And then make sure that there's contact information as well as like the student's student ID number so that they can attach. You know, it's common that maybe a student doesn't have the same last name as their parents. You want to make sure that the financial aid office can identify who the student is, what the circumstances are, and then be able to follow up with any additional questions or information. So here's an example. I lost my job in March 2020 when my place of business was permanently closed, or I was furloughed on this date. I'm hoping to return in the summer. You know, indicate if you know it's possibly temporary or permanent, any documentation from employers. Also include, so here's what my 2019 income information was, and here's what my current is, or what 2020 looked like, you know, income statements. I know Nikki's experienced this recently. Sometimes it's hard to get information from prior employers, especially if they've closed down. So anytime you do get anything like that, just encourage families to hold on to everything, keep all the documentation, all the pieces of paper, make copies of things even, just in case you're going to need it. And sometimes the financial aid office will require what's called the verification process as part of the appeal. So they'll want to take a look at the tax return, some other income information to build the appeal. And then predict to the best of your ability what the rest of the year looks like. So is this a temporary situation? Is there going to be a long-term impact? Anything that's, you know, going to change circumstances moving forward? Just be as clear and you know, but also concise, you know, not more than 2 pages tops in terms of explanation, but just be as clear as possible with here's where we were, here's where we are, here's what, you know, what we anticipate moving forward. We've also created an appeal kind of checklist guideline for you. So that's going to go over a little bit more in depth the things that I just spoke about in terms of best practices for building the appeal, what to look for, what other things might, you know, this is true even not in the pandemic circumstances. So let's say, you know, let's happily imagine a time far beyond now where things have returned to whatever normal is going to look like. And let's just say somebody did lose their job, or suddenly the household is moving from 2 incomes to 1 because there was a divorce, or somebody has major out-of-pocket medical expenses that came up that were unanticipated and uncovered by insurance. Any of those things can be an appeal at any point. So we're obviously focusing on the pandemic because I think it's going to be more common and financial aid offices are going to be dealing with more of these types of appeals in the next years as things are trickling after the pandemic. But just know that even long term, if there's a situation that happens to the student's family that impacts their ability to pay, they can always go through the appeals process We have a Wednesday webinar that we did about this in the Wednesday webinar playlist on YouTube that goes into much more specific detail about the whole process. So check that out if you want a little bit deeper dive into that. So as we're wrapping up here, please encourage your students and families to compare and really understand that bottom line. It's really important to make a smart financial decision, especially if you're in a situation where the family is going to need to consider borrowing for education. So really encourage them to do the math. We can help you. So we are planning probably in mid-March or so to do an aid offers workshop, which I'm going to guess is going to function similar to our FAFSA session in that we'll use breakout rooms to go through with families if they need to. There might be somebody at the high school. So there might be a contact, an individual that comes in and helps with FAFSA. So always check with the, whomever is available to help, FAME or any other individuals that, Gear Up or Trio or JMG or whoever is good, is the good FAFSA person in your school can help. Students might ask you to contribute a letter of support for their aid appeal. So just keep that in mind. Especially, students have built relationships with their school counselors, or they might approach another faculty member or coach, and you might have to say, here's what they're doing this for, and explain the circumstances. And always, of course, when in doubt, suggest that they call the financial aid office. They can certainly start with us if that feels more comfortable for whatever reason. We're absolutely willing to help, but it's never a problem to call and ask the financial aid office. They're there to explain particularly their process, their financial aid offers. They want to help. So always encourage asking the questions. There's no such thing as a foolish question in that case, and you may be surprised by the answer. So always encourage reaching out to the college directly with those types of questions. That's all I have on the formal presentation, but we have a little time for questions, comments, thoughts. We would love to hear from you about what you're seeing or any other questions that you have.
We just get a couple questions. I think they both pertain to, is it worth contacting the financial aid office to try to appeal? Either one way to negotiate aid, or also like if a student's parent is refusing to help. And my thoughts are on that. It never hurts. You're not out on anything, doesn't cost anything. So always reach out to the financial aid office. But I don't know about where you worked. When we had appeals, many times that appeal would result in a change in aid, many times. But there's so many variables, right? So it's hard to say, yeah, it's definitely going to happen. But especially with the pandemic, so many people have just lost income, and that's a huge hitter. So but I feel like keep in mind that when you are contacting the financial aid office, that they're receiving so much volume of calls right now of people saying, I've lost my job. If that's not your situation and you're just saying, hey, I got this offer over here, I want to negotiate, they may put you on the back of the burner, not necessarily because you're less important or whatever, but because they're trying to put out so many fires right now that I feel like those probably take priority over that. But also, and someone had said, should the student pursue the appeal or should it be the parent? So I'm gonna let you take that one, Maria.
Yeah, I think whenever possible in this process, we're always gonna say the student is in the driver's seat, right? This is their education. The FAFSA, the first part of their FAFSA, if you recall, asks about the student first, and then you're putting parent information on there. Again, generally, it's if the parent information is required on the FAFSA and it's the parent who has lost the job or the household circumstances, the student's going to say in their letter, my parent lost their job. So their income was this, it is now this. I have seen in my work in financial aid offices where the letter comes from the parent. That's fine, but certainly we always want students to be in the driver's seat as they're navigating this process. And to your earlier point, I would also add that, if it's a sticky situation, especially like they are inundated, but always reach out. If you're like, I'm not sure if this is an appealable thing, or I'm kind of confused, or this thing happened in my life and I have a question, always contact. It might be easier via email just because the phones might be really inundated with calls, and financial aid offices are hugely busy, and they're going to be taking on a lot more of this type of appeal probably than ever in terms of volume. So email, plus I tend to like email because then you've got answers in writing, everything's documented, you can remember what you said and when you said it. So if you're not somebody who takes notes when you make phone calls and keeps them, email is just a really great way to keep the conversation going and have it documented. But always ask. From the negotiation standpoint, as Nikki said, you're probably going to go towards the bottom of the list because they're going to want to address the students for whom circumstances have really changed and need an adjustment there. I will say that what's challenging about an appeal, and this is really far in the weeds, and the webinar will talk about this, but if let's say the student is already at a 0 EFC, which means they're going to get the maximum financial aid possible, there might not be a lot of adjustment that gets made based on a change of income because they've already been considered for maximum Pell Grant and things like that. But unless you sort of ask the question, you might not know. Maybe there's an extra pool of money to help meet the gap, or like schools have the CARES money that they could distribute, those kinds of things. So always worth asking the question and just being prepared that there's a lot of different variables that can impact what does and does not change a financial aid offer. Great questions. What a
awesome. These are great questions. When is the latest recommended time to send an appeal?
Oh, the latest time. I mean, I would certainly, bills, let's sort of talk about time frame. Generally, your first kind of bill cycle begins over the summer. So July, August, and I wouldn't do like the FAFSA and then immediately do an appeal before you've received any financial aid letters, right? So there's kind of a sweet spot of like, you've got some financial aid offers and you've realized that things have really changed. Somebody's lost a job since the FAFSA. I wouldn't wait until you get the bill to do the appeal. I would certainly give yourself some buffer room so that you can change plans if need be, so that you can say, okay, this isn't going to work, but this school's appeal worked out and I'm going to change my plans. So I would say before summer would be my best recommendation there. Again, a great question to ask a financial aid office. So like, what, if we're still making the decision, how late can I appeal? What? And certainly that's not to say that if something happens in the middle of the school year, right? So if somebody's lost a job, they haven't yet, but maybe they will. We still don't know what the impact is going to be. Certainly at that time, report those changes. So in that, as something happens that's impacting your ability to pay, always a good idea to reach out as well. But in terms of that first round, brand new student and comparing the aid offers, definitely give yourself some room to adjust. So I would say, before summer. Great questions.
Awesome. Strategies to offer if negotiating between institutions. And I'm not sure, this is such a tricky one to answer because, again, never hurts to put it out there that you're looking at two different schools. I think if your situation is that, you can't afford your dream school, I think that's important for them to know. But if you're saying, this school is, also do the math first, because I had many times that a student would come and say, this school offered me $20,000. I would say, well, yeah, but we're also 40,000 less than them. So, doing this calculation to see what that out-of-pocket cost is, that cost minus the grant money, what is your net price going to be? Because you may be trying to negotiate when they're already at the cheaper option. So I guess maybe just making sure that you have all of your information before going in for to negotiate, just to make sure that that's what you're looking at.
I know there's a lot of conversation around like negotiating merit, and that's kind of a different animal anyway, and that can happen in admissions. So sometimes we would hear like, well, maybe it's retaking SATs, or maybe, depending on what criteria they're using to determine that. Again, and that's certainly an admissions counselor question on some level if you're talking specifically about that merit piece. But Nikki's right, is sometimes you might be surprised at like doing the math, or the school that you just assumed was really expensive because you saw the sticker price, you're like, there's no way I can afford that. do the math. And if they offered you a good amount of aid right off the top, that might be the less expensive option. So going in prepared with like, here's the numbers. And, you know, if it's like a couple $1,000s that might sweeten that is the difference between you going and you not going, probably worth an ask. Like, hey, we're going to go here. Do you have like $2,000 more that you can stretch? And they might say yes, or they might say no. Always worth asking, but just know that the priority is going to likely be given to families that have been financially impacted in some way, to get those aid offers adjusted first.
Awesome questions.
Good question.
Best audience ever, Maria.
We got lucky. No, every audience is always great. That's why we're here, for clarity and questions. And again, and certainly if you have, you know, as school counselors in particular, lots of families that are coming to you with this, and you want to explore options. Again, we're going to try for March. I don't think we've nailed on a date yet for a workshop, but we'll certainly be putting those out there so you can promote them. But again, if you want to do something school specific or anything like that, or you have a lot of families that can't make whatever date that is, do reach out to us. We have done it in the past in person, and we'll do so virtually to help guide families through that process. And at that time too, we could talk, I'm sure we'll talk a little bit more about kind of the methods in which meeting that, you know, paying the bill, and more about the loans. I know somebody in the poll did talk about like Parent Plus, and I know there's lots of different considerations with paying the bill, and we took the appeals approach at the end of this one kind of intentionally, but we do have resources as well about, okay, like here's the financial aid, how do we pay the bill beyond that? So we have a video about that and information on our website, as well as previously recorded webinars about that, but certainly we will address that moving forward. Anything else coming up, Nikki?
Just to finish out, I've got a few people saying thank you to us. Thank you guys for joining us. I just want to say a shout out that if you know of anyone who has not done their FAFSA yet, financial aid priority deadlines are coming right up. And if you don't make that deadline, there's no takesies backsies. So we're having FAFSA help sessions. I put the registration link in the chat. So if you guys know anyone that needs to get their FAFSA done, even if they don't know what their plans are, there's no downside to getting it done. Come join us, and we're just as fun in those help sessions.
Yeah, and we are doing 2 during school vacation week. So I know that a lot of you are probably looking forward to disconnecting during that time, but if you have families for whom that's going to work well, we do have a daytime one next week as well. So always thank you for your hard work as you're navigating students through this process in a weird, wacky time to be alive. So thank you for giving us part of your afternoon. We'll hang out a little bit for questions, but thank you again, and I will let you know when the recording is available.